If the start of the Afghan Civil War was not bloody enough, its middle point in conclusion will certainly satisfy that urge, with even more bloodshed, chaos, and tragedy. In our follow-up video, we will see hundreds of thousands of Afghans dead alongside tens of thousands of deceased Soviets. The numbers for civilians fare even worse, with nearly 2 million Afghanis displaced from their homes in the Soviet phase of the war alone, and an even greater amount wounded. We pick up where we left off. The current situation has Soviet troops being brought into Afghanistan from outside of the country in order to stabilize Babar Kamal's failing government. Mujahideen factions have already been formed in response to the communist takeover. These groups are financed by pretty much everyone, and the money is funneled into Pakistani ISI. This has the unintended consequence of giving Pakistan absolute discretion of which Mujahideen factions actually receive any kind of funding. It is important not to look at these groups as some simple unified force that wars against the communists, but rather distinct organizations with their own interests and aspirations, especially in who will rule after the Soviets are removed. And realistically, these groups hated each other only slightly less than they hated the Soviets. Of the countless Mujahideen factions, there were 7 or 8 large ones. We focus on the 2 most important ones, Ahmad Shah Massoud's Mujahideen and Gulbuddin Hekmatyar's group. Massoud's group has the popular support, and he is considered to be the most powerful Islamist commander in Afghanistan. To this day, he is considered a national hero with the nickname Lion of Panjshir. His policies are relatively moderate, and he hopes to return the country to how it had been before the communist takeover, with citizens being able to freely live their lives in accordance with their traditions. Massoud would go on to receive nearly none of the Pakistani funding. He is considered too independent by ISI, and they need someone that would act within Afghanistan in ways favorable to their own personal interests and political goals. This is Gulbuddin Hekmatyar, a highly zealous Mujahideen commander that has little popular support in the country and is a relatively untalented commander. The reasons for their support of Hekmatyar are clear. With his limited power base, he would be reliant on Pakistan and would have to apply pressure in ways satisfactory to their demands. Additionally, Massoud receives mild support from the Indians, which the Pakistanis greatly oppose. The actual military operations involving Soviet-Afghan clashes are detailed and technical, but upon a simple military analysis, we can see several patterns emerge. The first is the guerrilla-style warfare the Mujahideen employ. This has made the news time and time again in modern conflicts, and of course in Vietnam, to which many Soviet-Afghan veterans report similar experiences. The idea is to abuse the slow, wooden movements of the conventional army and quietly poke and prod, bleating it as necessary. Once the occupier organizes a response, simply blend into a nearby civilian population. But to get a better idea of the battles, we have to dive deeper into the methodology of the conflict. The occupying Soviet army, or Oksva, spent most of their time guarding their supply lines and convoys. This passive strategy gives an advantage to the guerrillas, who are comfortably able to attack and retreat at their own leisure. To be able to commit to an active strategy, the Soviets would have to swell their army by roughly 3 times its size, and this would result in Soviet casualties that are nothing short of monumental, to say nothing of the geopolitical repercussions. This idea is never put into use, and the Soviets continue to apply their more inactive tactics. The Soviets also lack community support due to their mistreatment of local religious leaders and village elders, as well as the damage left behind by airstrikes. This hampers the all-important logistics of any operations and stifles information flow, giving the edge to the rebels who cooperate with local leaders. On an individual level, Soviet troops have difficulties with the terrain. Their training had not prepared them for the mountainous settings and landscapes. The rebels use this to their advantage, retreating into rural mountainous areas whenever they feel comfortable. Throughout all of this, the Soviets have one key advantage, that allows them to stay in the game. Unrivaled air supremacy. Complete and total air control is not something to be underestimated, and the Soviets would go on to use this powerful tool throughout the conflict. And though the rebels would triumph regardless, the much-lauded hand-launched Stinger missile provided by the United States would accelerate their victory, though military experts disagree on its impact. All these events combined with a weakening of the Soviet economy would eventually result in an order 10 years later by the new Soviet leader Mikhail Gorbachev to withdraw their forces. The idea is to continue the war via the Afghan Communist government by providing material support rather than committing their own ground troops. This transforms the traditional war into a proxy fight. Before their withdrawal, the Soviet leadership, dissatisfied with Babar Kamal's performance, would yet again install another Afghan leader. This time it would be Mohammad Najibullah, another Pacha member. However, their departure would only cause the situation to grow worse. As the Red troops withdraw, Massoud sees an opportunity for peace between most Mujahideen forces and seeks to create a unified Afghanistan. But Hekmatyar backs out from most ideas of cooperation and instead acts with the intention to build a single leader Afghanistan, with himself at the helm. He moves directly against Massoud and commonly captures and tortures his men to death. In response, the crafty Massoud retaliates, with his own capturing and imprisonment of Hekmatyar's soldiers, but instead allows them fair trials. Massoud is successful in keeping Hekmatyar off, all the while achieving magnificent victories against the interim communist government. We now arrive at a key point in the war. In the spring of 1989, Mujahideen forces, with Hekmatyar at the head, encircled the city of Jalalabad and launched a deadly siege against the troops and civilians within. But in a stunning twist, the communist government, who had become far more self-reliant since the Soviet exit, deal the rebels a spectacular defeat. This defeat is so humiliating to Hekmatyar and other commanders that Pakistani Brigadier General Mohammad Yusuf mentions that the jihad never recovered from Jalalabad. Despite their well-earned victory, the collapse of the Soviet Union and its withdrawal of material support would spell the end of Najibullah's government by 1992. Peace accords would be signed in April, and Massoud was to be given a defense minister position, while Hekmatyar would be given the title of prime minister. However, he would reject this offer in favor of establishing his own dictatorship, with Pakistan urging him to take power for himself. Massoud declares the following: "The Kabul regime is ready to surrender, so instead of fighting we should gather. The leaders are already meeting in Peshawar. The troops should not enter Kabul, they should enter later on as part of the government." In response, Hekmatyar issues the statement that he would enter the capital with our naked sword. No one can stop us. In an effort to keep the peace, Massoud is forced to move against Hekmatyar with his own forces, resulting in a bloody clash between Mujahideen. Massoud is victorious, but Hekmatyar, now pushed out of the capital, begins a relentless shelling campaign on both civilians and military targets, using Pakistani-supplied rockets. Hospitals are common targets along with other non-military regions. It is at this point that we must pause the story in order to examine something of far-lasting significance. Throughout the war, we have looked at the two primary groups, the Communists and the Afghani Mujahideen, but there has been a third player, one that would influence everything from that point forward. This was the foreign non-Afghan fighters that would come to fight in the jihad. The official term for these individuals are Afghan Arabs. The name is not entirely accurate, as none of them are Afghans and only a part are Arab. If we go to the origin, the idea is that Muslims must come to the defense of an occupation of Islamic Holy Land. Jihad means to struggle and persevere, and in this case to retake what had supposedly been stolen. As such, these foreign fighters flood into the country, with Osama bin Laden among them. Contrary to popular belief, these Afghan Arabs have only a marginal effect on the fighting. Roughly 30,000 entered to fight in the war, compared to the millions of native Afghanis that had fought since the start. They were in fact considered a curious sideshow to the real fighting. Unlike the Afghans, these foreign mujahideen would not receive large sums of money from ISI like Hekmatyar. And in particular, there is no evidence that Osama ever received any form of CIA training or funds. Again, this is purely a pragmatic move. The entire purpose of people like Osama bin Laden is that they are self-funded and self-motivated to kill Soviets, even though it was the native Afghans that did the heavy lifting. This flocking to Afghanistan is encouraged by Saudi Arabia, and many of them are of the Salafist sect of Sunni Islam, including bin Laden. The other prominent foreign Salafist is Abdullah Azzam. He is responsible for recruiting as many outside Muslims to the cause as he can. This includes travel to the United States and other countries, where he would weave stories to young students, speaking tales of singular mujahideen defeating whole battalions of Soviets, angels on horses that aided them in their holy struggle, and birds intercepting bombs. These non-Afghan Salafists proved to be significantly more radical than the native forces, chopping off the limbs of surrendering communists and ruthlessly exterminating anyone they deemed an infidel. As the war progresses, they become increasingly closed off from the main mujahideen struggle, establishing their own private training camps and schools, both in Afghanistan and Pakistan. In fact, it would be these Sunni-funded institutions, called madrasas, that would be responsible for the future radicalization of Afghan Arab veterans. You see, despite being called Islamic rebels, most of the mainstream mujahideen were not religious zealots by any means. They simply fought to preserve what they believed was their way of life. On the other hand, these foreign fighters believed they could spread their ultra-conservative ideals by establishing these madrasas, training and converting their followers to their sect. We return to the point where we had left off last. The Soviets are gone. The communist government has fallen. Massoud and his allies are somewhat in control of the capital, but are engaged with Hekmatyar. The Afghan Arabs have begun to radicalize initiates, and most of the country has gone to anarchy. For the average civilian, this meant that the rule of law for your village was determined by your local warlord. Indeed, the chaos that ran through the nation in the aftermath of the war allowed for the rise of warlords and their subsequent takeover of Afghan society. Kidnapping and rape of women as well as children are everyday occurrences. Enter the Taliban. The word itself means students in Pashto, and students is correct. These men are educated in the ideologically conservative madrasas. Their origin story is disputed, but has been told by the creator of the Taliban, Mullah Omar, a local religious head. A local warlord had abducted 2 young girls, and Omar, rejecting this act as un-Islamic, organizes a very small group of his students and rescues the children and eradicates their kidnappers. In another instance, Omar leads his group to eliminate 2 local militia commanders that had wanted to sodomize a young boy. It is important to note that these Taliban members were not Salafists. Rather, they were of the Deobandi school of Islam, yet another conservative, fundamentalist Islamic sect. What is interesting about them is their study in both Pakistani and Saudi-style madrasas, where they would absorb Salafist ideals and principles. So what we have here is a unique cross-pollination of a fundamentalist tribal culture with more extremist Salafist ideas. Needless to say, the enacting of swift justice amongst the chaos wins massive popular support for Omar's Taliban. Afghanis see them as a group that could restore order to a lawless nation. At this point, Hekmatyar is internationally hot. That is to say, no country wants any direct affiliation with him, including Pakistan and Saudi Arabia, the 2 primary funders. The United States had cut off support once the communists were out of power, washing their hands of the deal. The Saudis and Pakistanis see promise in the Taliban, and they pour money into their organization. And with this, the Taliban would go on to conquer the rest of the country in a few short years. They engage and easily defeat Hekmatyar, boxing him out completely. And they launch a relentless attack on Massoud, who would go on to retreat to the north and wage a genius guerrilla campaign against the Taliban. He would meet his end in 2001 before having a chance to collaborate with the Americans in their invasion. After years of fighting the Taliban and surviving, he would lose his life from a car bomb in an operation by Al-Qaeda. Hekmatyar is still running about, but without the funding from ISI, he is effectively a non-state nobody. The Taliban succeeds in their takeover of Afghanistan, but would become what they had set out to prevent. Rural warlords that murder civilians, slaughter women and children, force Afghanis to grow drug crops for their own personal wealth, and provide protection for jihadist elements. The Saudis and Pakistanis quickly realized that they had created an insubordinate element, as the Taliban rejects all orders from both countries and seizes power for themselves. But Laden and Osama would go on to co-found Al-Qaeda and use bin Laden's fortune to grow the group into a global Salafist jihadist entity. Of interest to note is the combination of the Saudi brand ultra-conservative Salafism and the teachings of Sayyid Qutb in his idea of global jihad. Until then, the idea of a jihad only involved retaking Islamic land. Osama bin Laden, learning from Qutb's teachings, believed he could override this idea with the concept of a global jihad, where military personnel as well as innocent bystanders should be targeted. Put simply, if al-Wahhab and Sayyid Qutb were the architects, then Osama bin Laden would clearly be the engineer that combines these two ideologies together in a practical sense. And ISIS, Jabhat al-Nusra and most other fundamentalist jihadist organizations would originate from his Al-Qaeda group. So what burning questions can we answer with this information? Did the American-funded Mujahideen become the Taliban they would fight against 10 years later? No, the Mujahideen fought against and were defeated by the Taliban. What of the growth of Salafist jihadist groups? Did the US indirectly promote these organizations? Not really. The creation of these groups is mainly attributed to bin Laden and Osama's personal intentions. They saw an opportunity in the war to build their own group, and bin Laden had plenty of his own money to create Al-Qaeda. So are the Soviets responsible for the disruption in the Middle East that led to such groups? Partially. The Soviet entry into the war resulted in a massive Islamist response from the Middle East, and their direct support of secular government only added more fuel to the fire. But again, they did not enter with the intention of promoting radical elements, and the rebels they fought are not the jihadists we see today. Not to mention that Pakistan and Saudi Arabia's promotion and funding of dangerous groups like Hekmatyar and later the Taliban only confused the situation more. There is only one group that should receive the full blame, and that is Osama and Osama. Bin Laden was keenly aware that he could use the chaos to further his own goals and build up his organization.